This is the Wealth Standard Podcast, the gold standard in all things financial.
Hi, everyone. This is Patrick Donahoe. Welcome to episode 193 of the Wealth Standard Podcast. And I have a pretty cool guy in the office right now. Even cooler that he's wearing an MMA sweatshirt. as if you weren't intimidating enough, now you have to wear like an MMA. If you ever want a guy like in your corner, if you're in a dark alley, it's Andy Tanner.
Oh, the bigger you are, the harder you fall, man. That's not true.
I doubt that.
You know me. I'm a teddy bear.
No, you're not. Well, you are, but you're not. Andy, how's it going, dude?
So good to be with you, Patrick.
Yeah, likewise.
It's been a while since we've talked, so it's going to be great. I'm looking forward to this.
I sent you a little picture the other day of when we did the Cash Flow Wealth Summit, and I was like, so I like grew facial hair so that I'd look like, because if we had a picture, I'm like, yeah, I'm not like a little boy.
You know, I'm not masculine enough to do that.
So what's new? How's life?
You know, it's really, really good. It's a really fun time to be an entrepreneur. There's never, I don't think there's ever been a time that there's been more challenges for people to face, but I also think that there's never been a time with so much opportunity. So it's a wonderful time to be an entrepreneur, a wonderful time to be an investor, and a great time to be a student because there's so much you can learn so fast.
Well, I think it's interesting, and we're going to go into a really cool book today that you guys are reading as Rich Dad Advisors, called The Road to Ruin by Jim Rickards. But I would say, in this kind of arena that we're in, there's so much information, there's so much perspective, so much bias. So there's a ton of opportunity, but at the same time, it's kind of, you have all sorts of kind of diverging type of opinions and biases, and people are you can write a book in, a month these days. Yeah. And so you have everybody kind of coming out with information. And it's sometimes really difficult to filter, right, what's rhetoric, right, what's fact, what's fiction. So you find that difficult? There's tons of, talk about all the books that you can read. It's like, and it's insane. And they're all pulling kind of in different directions sometimes.
I agree. I think, we do, you mentioned being a Rich Dad Advisor. A lot of people think that's a teaching role, and it's really not. We're just students. We study a ton, and we get together once in a while as students. And Robert Kiyosaki. He's an insatiable learner, and so I agree. It's tough to know what someone's opinion is, but what we'll do with a book study is we really have very few rules. We just say, hey, what did the author say? Mm-hmm. So rather than coming with our own opinions, we leave those outside. We check those at the door. And we just say, okay, let's take a look at what this guy's saying and really understand what he is saying. And then after that, you can go back and put it in context and say, well, is this baloney? Like you say, is it opinion? Is it rhetoric? Does he have an agenda? Does he have a bias? Almost everybody does. Yeah. Nonetheless, if you don't read, then you can't make those evaluations.
Well, if you're reading, you could read from your perspective, right, which is just a filter to the information. So you're reading, you're not reading as if, as what they're saying. You're reading what you think they're saying, which is biased and short-sighted. So no, it's a powerful way to learn. Yeah,
we all have we all seek confirmation bias. It's a bigger picture is this: when a human brain encounters information, it probably processes it in at least two ways. Number one, does this information fit with what I know? Is it logical? Does it make sense? Is there a deductive reason you can say, oh, this could work. This could make sense in the world. But there's also a part of us, and it's the dangerous part, that reacts, that says, well, do I like how this information makes me feel? Is this good or bad? It doesn't care whether it's true or whether it's false. It just says, does this make... And that's the danger of it. So I don't want to discard something simply because it makes me feel uncomfortable, or it suggests that I'm not in an advantageous position, or that it gives me bad news. That's not wise reading. We want to approach it more intellectually and logically rather than emotionally. Say, okay, is what he's saying make sense? Is it possible? how does this jive with the other things I've learned, and then you do your best to make decisions.
Well, it changes. It changes what you learn, right? Because if you're going through that filter, like you have certain things, and it's kind of like you may be justifying, or you're invalidating what contradicts, but you're justifying what you agree with.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how we read sometimes. We don't really learn from that. You learn based on, okay, I'm not going to have a bias. This guy, he may have a nefarious way of looking at the world and the economy, but I want to look at it from his standpoint and see what his experiences has shown him, which are totally different than mine.
Yep.
His background's totally different than mine. What can I glean from that? And then after the fact, figure out what has merit and what doesn't. That's the whole edge of the coin type of conversation.
At the very least, it's fascinating because of Rickards' history and story and the meetings he's been. I mean, he's been in a lot of meetings where I would have loved to have been on a fly on the wall watching that stuff. And so he does have, he's speaking through his lens, but nonetheless, he's been in places and situations that are pretty big time. And I like listening to him.
No, so do I. And he's a fascinating guy to listen to, right? And he tells some good stories. But I would say when I first read his Currency Wars book, but that's when he went in and talked about the war games. And this was years ago that he did it, but they talk about the war games that the United States government plays, right, to simulate potential threats, not just physical threats, but economic
cyber threats,
social threats.
Yeah, and there's certainly warfare. I mean, it's a tactic. There's no question. This goes back to even to the Revolutionary War when we didn't have a U.S. dollar in we just declared our own, stake our claim here. So we're independent from you, Britain. And so they, the Continental Congress got together and they came up with the Continental. It was a fiat currency. It was out of nothing. They here are these Continentals. Well, the Brits, they counterfeit. It was pretty easy to counterfeit in those days. Everything was written down on paper. So they flooded our country with counterfeit notes. And it collapsed. It assisted. It would have collapsed anyway, but it assisted and sped up the collapse of the Continental. So it's economic warfare.
Well, I think, and we can go off on a tangent of that for a little bit, because if you look at today, I mean, everything's fiat, everything's paper.
Out of nothing.
But the difference between today and then is you have more it's more widely used, right? More widely acceptable. Now it becomes, has a lot more power behind it.
Yeah.
And it's more of the faith associated with it, that you give it to someone and they will accept it, and then you can, get your good, but they can take whatever that acceptable currency is and exchange it for something else, right, of equal value, right?
What I think the discussion does is it's a spur to all of us to learn more, because so much of it's counterintuitive if we're new to it. For example, why would I want the value of my own currency to go down? That's very counterintuitive. Why would China devalue their own currency? Well, it's trade.
It's trade, yep.
And to learn, it's part of your financial education, is to begin to ask those questions. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Well, and again, like we said, let go of the bias.
Yep.
See what's really being said, and then maybe you can figure out where the logic is.
Yeah, because it may not make sense to you, right? But if they were doing it, it probably makes sense to them.
None of us have a correct map, but the only way to correct our map and get as close as we can to whatever reality is to study, listen, evaluate, and that's what we're going to do here.
No, and I love Rickards because he uses, I mean, he writes very clearly, but he uses just a lot of different examples to kind of formulate his narrative, right? And his foundation for what he says is going on. And he also makes, and I wouldn't say he's very specific on exactly what's going to happen, but he looks at a lot of events of the past that have similarities, books.
Yeah.
And he formulates kind of this, here's what's most likely to happen in the future. And the road, again, that's that path to ruin. And then he defines kind of what that is. We probably won't get to everything today, but as you've seen Rickards before, and you've read some of his books, really getting into how he starts to formulate it. Is there something you learned in there about whether some of the stories associated with like Ice Nine, or with the stories associated with some of the other locations, like these mysterious, rarely known about installations that the government has, where they experiment with certain things? Are they experimenting with like those chemical warfare and atomic bombs and nuclear bombs? Have you read any of that or know about that before?
There's several insights that he gave me. Maybe less about the that's really exciting stuff. Here's a government entity or installation that very few, it's located here, and it's by a wire fence, and he describes the what it looks like, the security clearance, and it's very theatrical that way.
Yeah.
But the thing he said that I really took to heart, that's interesting. He talks about the people who run the regulatory body, the Alan Greenspans at the time, the Ben Bernanke's at the time. And he talks about Alan Greenspan as saying, he wasn't very smart then, he might not be very smart now. And that's a pretty big...
That's a bold statement.
It is a bold statement, and whether he's right or not, I don't know, but we know he said it, and it really does... it's an interesting question, because when you talk about warfare, if my gun is bigger than yours, I feel pretty good, and if I have more missiles, I feel pretty good. But when you start talking about cyber warfare, and even more importantly, economic warfare, it's not safe to assume that the leaders are the smartest people in the room. And in order for a regulatory body to be effective, if they're going to make monetary policy or regulations, you almost have to begin at the assumption that they're the smartest people in the room and that they know what's best, because policy is how we're going to work things. So here you have Alan Greenspan in charge of policy, and you have the SEC in charge of regulations for the most part. And if they're not the smartest guys in the room, they don't know what they're doing, that's kind of a dangerous place to be, because in that sense, your general isn't competent. And like you said, it's a very bold accusation, because Alan Greenspan, some people say, well, he's a dummy. Other people say he's not. But it is an interesting notion to consider his hypothesis to say, or not even hypothesis. I mean, he's really saying, this is my opinion, that these guys are not very smart.
But but if you think about it from a psychological standpoint, I mean, Greenspan was called the maestro.
Yeah.
And then you had Bernanke and have all these different accolades, and looking at and he goes into kind of the complexity theory, but you go into how complex the world economy is.
Does anyone really understand it fully? No. Is there a guy that can step up to a podium and say, this is what's happening, this is where it's going to head? It might be so complex, that person might not even exist. Yeah. There might not be the guy who knows. And
that dynamic is why I think a lot of these leaders lead with this kind of facade of being intelligent, being smart, being educated, so that people will have faith in them to do something about it. Because most people have no clue how the economy works. They have no idea what...
Even the economists, according to him.
Yeah. Serious, and they have an angle on it, but he made that point really in the beginning of the book, where he talked about the different theories of economics.
Right.
You have the monetarists, you have the Keynesians, you have the Milton Friedman, which I guess are kind of the monetarists. Then you have the Austrian side of things, and they all have elements, right, where it makes sense, but it may not be fully comprehensive. Right. But in the end, he's basically saying that how complex it is the reason why we're in the mess that we're in, because. And this goes to some things that I learned from the chief economist at Fannie Mae, who was on the cruise the other week that you've been on before. But he talked a lot about how the whole meltdown occurred, right? And they were essentially trying to fix a problem, right? And the bond market, right, it already collapsed because you had sellers and you didn't have any buyers. So there was no price. So nobody could sell, but they had to sell or else the markets would have frozen. So basically, it was to the point where nobody knew really what to do. Okay, but they essentially used their power to paper over problems, which has been done over and over and over again in the past. And it's the only solution that they have other than correction and collapse, which they're like so afraid of. But looking at the solution to the problem, it's not a solution. It's a Band-Aid. What happened then? And this I had a fascinating conversation with him, which was, it's not a Band-Aid. Okay, well, I'm sorry, it's not a solution. It's a Band-Aid, because you're creating other problems. There's unintended consequences always, especially when you're dealing with things at that extreme.
Yeah. You might just be rolling a snowball up a hill. It gets higher. It's got more potential energy. It's got more mass.
Yeah.
And one of the things a person might consider is that mistakes have consequences, and sometimes it's best just to say, you know what, let's pay the piper. But sometimes paying the piper is so costly and so painful and so difficult that we say, well, what else can we do?
Yeah.
And that seems to be what may have happened. Is we have a subprime meltdown. It's devastating to many people's lives, many institutions. So Federal Reserve, step in and do what you can to save it. So I agree. I don't know that this problem was fixed. It might have been kicked. I don't want to say kicked down rolled the snowball up the hill a little further.
Yeah,
it's not going to
can down the road is just like it's the same can. This is a way different can. It's a much bigger can.
This is like, I don't want the snowball to run over me right now, so I'll just make it
an
bigger,
oil tanker,
and I'll roll it up the hill a little further. But what he says is that we had a crash. We had a crash in 2000. That was a .com deal. But he talks about the subprime crash, the Lehman, the Bear Stearns, and he says that's nothing compared. That the next one, he says we might not be able to roll this. We might not be able to fix this one, or postpone this one, or defend this one. That the Federal Reserve, they had to. He talks about the Federal Reserve and their resources, and I don't know why their resources would ever be limited, because they can do what they want. But he said, they might lose faith. People in the world might lose confidence.
That's it.
They might lose confidence in the Federal Reserve when you invent that much money, when you take on that many toxic assets, when you buy out. I remember in the book at one point he says, well, it was not even in his purview that the Fed would come to a rescue. He was going to other banks. He was going to other institutions saying, look, we're in trouble. We're going down. If we go down, you guys will probably go down with us, so you better. It's almost like if your tenant was saying, look, I've lost my job, so if you don't pay my rent, you're going down with me.
Yep.
And they were all so tied together. But it didn't seem that at the time from his writing they ever imagined the Fed would step in.
Yeah, and this is where, because he had a very intimate knowledge of long-term capital management, which is this whole example.
He was in those meetings.
Exactly, and that's where I think kind of Greenspan stepped in. What he was saying is very, very interesting. Let me just see if I can articulate this well. So he basically, the overarching theme is that they're afraid of losing the trust or credibility of people. So if you paper over, like go back to long-term capital management, they did that because they were afraid of what the results would be if they let it fail.
Exactly.
Because if they let it fail,
which comes back to what we were saying about sometimes when it's time to pay the piper, it's too big to fail. It hurts too much, too much carnage to let it fail. But it's as if you have a choice.
But they're also afraid of losing their credibility.
Yeah,
because if it fails, it failed under their watch.
Yeah,
and they will be the ones to blame. So if it starts there, then you go into everything that happened in 2008. It's the same thing, and this is what Doug Duncan told me. He said that that we would have had 25% unemployment.
Yeah,
it's like, and markets would have frozen.
Oh,
but at the same time, it's okay. They papered over it. But looking at if they let it fail, that might have been, that's the whole kind of creative destruction from Joseph Schumpeter that Rickards refers to more than once in the book. But if you have that, who knows what we would have learned. Now, they may have looked like they had egg on their face. Maybe, maybe not. But instead of risking their credibility, they decided to exercise that power.
It's a dangerous idea. It's certainly not a capitalistic idea, but it's a dangerous idea that he says in the book. He says, look, there's a list of institutions that have been deemed as untouchable, that these will not fail. And you pay your political contributions, he says, and you become one of the good old boys, and you get on that list. But the question then comes is, okay, so these guys are too big to fail. No matter what, we're going to do whatever it takes. But then there's a difference between too big to fail and too big to bail. Mm-hmm. And if it gets too big, I thought the argument was interesting that the Fed wouldn't be able to do it because they'd lose their credibility and their standing in the world. That it just get to the point where, like, you can't do this anymore.
And then it's one of those, like, if it's discovered, the curtain's pulled back. I mean, those consequences are catastrophic, right?
Yeah, they're dire.
So I looking at what Rickards is kind of alluding to, and maybe this is more of our interpretation, but I would say with what he's alluding to, he's building this case for, really starting way back in the day, the solution to all of those, potentially catastrophic problems weren't resolved.
Correct. They kicked the can down the road.
And it's been going on for a long time.
It wasn't truly deleveraged. There's still a lot of derivatives out there. There's still a lot of the regulations are very complex. And, regulation, I get it. You got to have some. You can't just let people run wild. At the same time, we're naive if we think regulation can fix. Look, it's astounding as he talks about the order of magnitude of leverage that these guys were using to make money. I mean, the greed or whatever, but when you're dealing with money, people are going to do whatever they can do to make the most, the fastest. Yep. And these guys had leverage ideas with kinds of arbitrage and leverage instruments to an order of magnitude that's astounding. I mean, I'm a trader. I look at the market every day, and I use a little leverage, but the amount of leverage these guys had, it was astronomical. I mean, it was completely took my breath away. Well,
did they have a choice? I mean, if you're trying to hit certain returns like that, especially a lot of those bond traders, right? Did they have a choice? Because they didn't use leverage, would they have hit as high of a return as they were hitting?
No. I mean, it's competitive, so you always have a choice.
Yeah, but at the same time,
you're competing. Yeah, you're competing against Goldman, and you're competing for investor dollars, and which allows you leverage even better because you're using their money, not yours.
Kind of have to. Then
is it a choice? Well, it's like going for it on fourth down. Well, we didn't have a choice. Well, yeah, you could have lost the game. So yeah, it did put them, the competitive nature of it. But like you said, is it deleveraged? No. And boy, I'll tell you, he sure has been in some interesting places, some interesting meetings. And when he talks about the parallels of then to now and where this could go, the message. So what's the lesson? We know what he said. What's the lesson? Well, get smart, get ready. And I always say this whenever I talk in a discussion like this, Patrick, and you're a risk guy, you're an insurance guy. Mm-hmm. It's not the risks you can see coming. It's and I've mentioned this to my friend Robert. We were on the phone together talking about this very book, and I said, Rickards does a very good job of building his case for a collapse by saying, well, look at this data. Look at this situation A, situation B. You look at it and you say, yeah, these are serious storm clouds. But going outside of the book, what are the things that Rickards doesn't see? Because there's always stuff you can't see. Mm-hmm. So the lesson is, look, as you look at these storm clouds, it makes you want to learn how to play defense. Mm-hmm. It makes you learn how to say, okay, if there's something bad going to happen, how do I set myself up to where I can not get swept up in the consequences? Mm-hmm. How can I? It's protecting yourself. Yeah. And I says, we have to do that anyway. Even without a Rickards book, you have to protect yourself against the stuff you can't see. Mm-hmm. Your neighbor's playing with matches. You think, hey, that's dangerous. My house might burn down. But the lightning bolt you never imagined would hit and start it, or whatever it was that started it. So it's just a great message of defense.
Yeah, and I think with Rickards, he provides a lot of the data side of things. He also uses quotes, and he formulates his argument really well.
Oh, he's got data. He's not just spouting off.
And it's examples too. Like he uses this is what's happened in the past. They've because he goes into the involvement of the IMF. Especially recently with some of the issues in Europe, and so he kind of alludes to a lot of the things that were said in meetings at the G20. He cites certain things that they've said would be measurements with what would happen if this happened with a country of more significance, right? Instead of like a Greece or a Cyprus. Yeah. And so I think looking at kind of how he formulates, and he did allude to it, correct me if I'm wrong, but he did say, you never really know like what the outcome is going to be. Yeah. But there's like these there's breadcrumbs. There's crumbs that kind of here's the road, breadcrumb after breadcrumb after breadcrumb. Here's what could happen. But in the end, you know exactly what the event is, and that's where he goes into his complexity theory. You don't know what the event is that's going to cause the next correction.
He talks about a snowflake landing on the avalanche.
Yeah.
So I can see the avalanche, and I can see the potential energy of the avalanche, and I can see this baby's ready to go. Now, can I pinpoint which is the snowflake? Which one of these million snowflakes falling on this thing is the one that puts it over? No, but I can see the avalanche.
I can see the avalanche.
I've seen others. I know what they look like, and this is one.
Yeah.
Don't know how or why which one triggers it. Another thing that's helpful from this book that I found value in is risk, and I think this is a principle that might be true in all cases. There's a relationship between risk and control. I haven't found a way to disprove that. If I can control the outcome, I have the ability to manipulate the outcome to my favor, and I have that power, risk goes down. But when I have no control, risk goes up. Mm-hmm. And one of the great lessons or reminders of this book is that there's this illusion that we would have, that the money even belongs to you, that you can do with what, it's an illusion. You have money in a 401k, and you say, well, this is my 401k, this is my retirement. Well, says who? Who has control of that money? Mm-hmm. The ICE 9, tell me what you felt about his ICE 9 references.
Well, we'll first back up with the whole like control thing. I think you're right. People have this false sense of what they own, what's theirs, and I've always looked at how people view money. We can get that.
Sorry,
went through the wrong pipe.
Risk of taking a drink during a podcast. Right down the old windpipe there. See, I'm wearing my MMA shirt, and now I'm getting choked out by my water.
By Essentia.
All right.
No, I was okay. What was I saying? I was saying that the whole control idea.
There's risk and control.
Yeah. So the risk. I mean, the whole idea with that is that we have this false sense of ownership, right? Because we think it's ours, but by these are really intelligent financial institutions, right, that have gone through cycles, and they put into place procedures so that if there's other cycles, there's other events that occurred, they're in the position of control, power, right, and power. So looking at some of the things he cited with what some of the language of Dodd-Frank allows banks to convert deposits into equity, like equity or share, and also looking at 401k, or looking at really any by the government qualified plans can all be modified, right? Their language is a tax statute that can be modified by a vote a vote here, a vote there, or executive order. I mean, there's a lot of different things that they can do in order to put themselves in. Well, they're already in control, right? But to get at financial resources. So I would say, really in the end, it's the idea behind becoming educated. That's the best way to be in control, so that you do, know what your actions are going to be in those type of circumstances. And I think he alludes to that to an extent. But in the end, I would say that the only thing you really do have control over is where the money comes from in the first place, which is you, right? And the assets that you have. If it's you can, if you know how to start a business and provide value to somebody else, it doesn't matter what the currency is, okay? You're the source of whatever that value is, right?
It's a fool's errand to seek risk-free. And I think that's where a lot of investors make a mistake, is they say, look, I want risk-free this, risk-free that. And so, but what the book does do, well, this is what the book does. It makes you say, it makes you take an inventory of where your control may be and where your holes might be. For example, if you're a trader like me and something bad were to happen right now, if I was a day trader and all of a sudden my phone dies, can I borrow your phone? Or maybe the network dies, or maybe there's a terrorist attack and I can't get to make the change I need. Okay, that's a lack of control, right? So I would have to have instruments ready. I would have to have things in place that would help me if I'm not there. And that's the idea. But to say, people who amass lots of wealth struggle with this, because the fact of the matter is, the government can do anything they want. For example, he talked about the confiscation of gold. Guy goes up, builds up a whole bunch of gold. Government passes a law, says, guess what? This gold is now illegal for you to hold it. You got to hand it over to us, just by a law. Okay, so now you go to jail or comply, right? You say, well, I have some real estate. Government comes and says, well, we want to build a highway.
Eminent domain.
This is called eminent domain. So, what control do you really have? You don't have any. You have to have a certain amount of faith and trust in probabilities, and then you try to do everything you can. But to find a risk-free scenario, I think you do the best you can on it, but welcome to investing.
Yep.
And people say, well, then why invest? Well, there's also risk to not investing. If I'm scared of ICE 9, which is an ICE 9 for those, it's a reference to
Kurt Vonnegut's The Cat's Cradle.
The Cat's Cradle. And in the story, there's this science fiction type of compound that it's water that freezes at room temperature, and that water that touches any other water will freeze it. So if you dropped it in the ocean, you basically kill the world. Yep. And that's what they mean by ICE 9, that the global elite have systems in place
to freeze,
that freeze everything, lock you out while the global elite clean their house. Once they've got their house cleaned, and this happened, by the way, it's
happened multiple times.
You go see The Big Short, it happened then too. Yeah. They clean their house, and then they'll open it up, and then you fend for yourself.
Yep.
So
the freeze is like they freeze markets, so they shut down the stock market.
Well, they just make a phone call and say, hey, the market's closed for a certain amount of time. And they did this in 9/11. I mean, it can happen. In 9/11, they shut the market down for 4 days. And when you woke up in the morning, if you held airline stocks on that fourth day, now if you had put options, you'd have been fine. But if you had stop losses, you wouldn't have been fine. And see, so there you have it. Stop loss is an attempt at control. Okay.
But it's not risk-free.
Yeah, and if they keep it closed longer than the option's expiration, well, then I guess you're out of luck too. So
that's interesting.
So, and people argue, real estate's the best, gold's the best. Look, government can take what they want. No asset class is safe.
Yeah, you say the best under certain circumstances, not all circumstances.
Yeah. Go buy gold. Well, they've already proven once that that would never happen again. Yeah. Well, you can't say that.
Yeah, and also real estate, it's like, well, I have cash flow coming in. Well, what if they have rent controls?
Yeah.
There's a lot of, the circumstances dictate whether something's good or bad.
I mean, I have a really close friend who's an investor. I won't mention his name here. I have a lot of real estate investing friends. But I asked him about this. Like, okay, you say you have real estate, you're comfortable with that. What happens when your renters can't pay rent? What happens when, like in Spain, they're doing in Spain, they're moving in with their parents. When you can't afford rent, you consolidate and you move in with mom and dad. That's the best, families consolidate. They get together and they got 20 people living in one house.
Yeah.
I says, what happens to that? Oh no, we have Section 8 housing. The government will pay for it. Well, now you're depending on the government.
Yep.
And I don't trust the government.
No, in all circumstances, that's there's always things that can change, and you never can prepare for that. And I think that's what he's saying with the whole ICE 9 is that back in during the Great Depression, during World Wars, during there's even been the stock market closed for sections of the day because of a flash crashes.
Yeah, they'll say, hey, no shorting allowed right now.
Yeah.
No shorting.
And they did that
allowed.
during the 2008, 2009. You couldn't short financial stocks, right?
I mean, there's other countries. Forgive me if I'm wrong, but I'll throw this one out. I think I'm right. Like Malaysia or Singapore, their neighbors, one of the two, they said, look, no shorting stocks. And it was like for a long period of time. It wasn't even a temporary thing. It was like, no shorting stocks in our country. That's the law. And they changed it later on because, if you don't have that yin and yang, it messes up markets.
Yep.
But the big lesson is simply this. If we don't learn and we don't consider, then we are more exposed to risk. And we want to protect ourselves to the degree that we can and weigh it against not taking any risk. What's the risk of not taking risk?
Yeah. Well, there's and it comes down to how do you mitigate it, right? And it's not one strategy or two. I mean, it comes down to educate yourself first, right? Then position yourself, just according to that education. But I think the ICE 9 reference is really dealing with like in the future, like this whole path, the road to ruin. The sign, event, and then at that kind of precipice, there is a freeze so they can figure it out, and they're positioning themselves to do it. The IMF is most central banks are major currency, whether it's China or the US. I mean, they're all positioning themselves for that, and he gives evidence throughout the book. And then as that event occurs, whatever it is, whatever that snowflake is, that's what's most likely going to happen. So if that does happen, where does that put you? Is that, do you kind of...
I think, that nails it. I mean, that's the way a person thinks. I always think of investing in 4 areas of education. We want to, and he mentions all of these, not by the names I use, but you can see it. The book is a better read if you understand this. By the way, this is not a beginner's book. There's a lot of jargon in this book. Yep. There's a lot of people that will have to keep their Google handy when he refers to things because he writes to an audience that is in the know, no question.
Absolutely.
With his jargon.
And he's throwing Latin terms out there too. There's like, I have no idea.
So if a person understands, first thing a person would understand, if they understand fundamentals and what a fundamental analysis is, that's one avalanche. If they understand how markets change trend and go up and down, that's another one. How to pull cash flow out is there with all that leverage we talked about. But this is really a risk management book. And of all those 4 pillars, risk management reigns supreme. The guys that are the best at that are the guys that survive and thrive. And the more I've made mistakes investing and watched other people make bigger mistakes investing, the more I'm convinced that you don't want to be a fear monger and you don't want to be Chicken Little and think the sky is falling all the time. You want to be an optimist. Pessimistic investors aren't good investors. There's a brightness of the future. But with that said, understanding how risk is managed is in many ways possible in all asset classes. That's not going to do you any harm.
Well, and the pessimistic side of things is you're letting emotion control the investment, and so you look to the future, and whatever events occur. I mean, some of them you don't have control over the events themselves. Things are the way they are right now. There's nothing we can do to change it. Okay? What's going to happen down the line? Who really knows exactly what is going to happen? But there's signs that are all around us, and he points to a lot of those signs.
Well, we know the avalanche is there. His avalanche analogy is the best one in the book.
I agree.
I mean, he says, look, you're asking me to, everyone wants to know what snowflake it is. He says, look, this is chaos theory. It's unknowable. Yep. So let's tap out to that idea and say, look, we're not going to know which snowflake it is. But look at this. There's a boatload of snow here. It's on this ledge. You can see it. And you absolutely know that if the snow continues to pile up, you can do the physics and you can do the math to say, look, this is no longer sustainable. This is going to come down. Yep. Can you get that to predict which snowflake it's going to be?
Nope.
That's chaos theory. And that's where, it's interesting because he mentions these so-called leaders that are in the know, right? And he makes a really compelling case. He says, look, they're basing their forecasts and their policies off of flawed economic theories, the ones you mentioned, the Keynesian theory, the Austrian theory. And as Keynesians and Austrians fight and battle about which theory is right, he's saying, you guys are basing your policies on theories that are obsolete. I mean, you're like bloodletting doctors back in the 1700s. Your medicine is bad. Chaos theory, it's not Keynesian or Austrian. It's chaos theory. And he makes a great case for that. That was a very compelling part of it.
Yeah, I love that part because it made a lot of sense to me because, he does allude to the fact that, there's been this kind of like morphing into new schools like the NeoKeynesian thought, and even some of the Austrian school. I mean, Keynes himself talked about the positives of holding gold.
Yeah, it was.
But yet today, Keynesians are more. It's increasing aggregate demand at whatever costs possible, but that's not necessarily what Keynes.
Volcker, or who was it in the book where he called him up and he says, I think I'm starting to understand where you come from with this Keynesian. You right, and the guy says, that's interesting that because I think I just changed my mind, right? I mean, because it does change. And
I think if people have an open mind and they're not stuck to some sort of like dogma, right? Because I think if you get into a certain school of thought, and that's what he talks about, where you have these guys that come up with their theories based on a certain set of variables that may have been in the past, but even one little variable could change. I think he talked about that with Milton Friedman, where it was that whole measurement of volatility that was off. If a monetarist were to use his kind of theorem today,
yeah. Dogma is dangerous.
No, it is.
Dogma, well, it's like Steve Jobs says, don't be tracked by dogma. You're going to live with the results of other people's thinking. Yeah. And there's a lot of truth that the world changes. And if people get their religious convictions, their political convictions, their whatever convictions they have, you got to set those aside and say, okay, what's real? Yeah. Because you cannot, everyone assumes they're right. And boy, that's dangerous thinking.
It is. And that's what we talked about before, whereas nobody wants to have that I was wrong, because you lose credibility. Yeah. And when you lose credibility, there could be some catastrophe from that. But at the same time, if you stick to never being wrong, it's just that's the really rolling the snowball up the hill.
That's a rough deal. So I think this book's bigger than just one podcast.
Yep, I agree.
For sure. We probably ought to do some more thinking and digesting on it and do another one. But as it stands right now, biggest lessons I got from it are reinforcement of find where your controls are and look for where you can't control things, and you try to plug those holes as best you can. Is the way to do it. And people who sell gold are going to say buy gold. People who sell stocks are going to say stocks are the best. People are going to who sell real estate, you can say real estate's the best. He's got fine art in there. Yeah. Somewhere. No, and 5% in fine art. Yeah.
And I would hope that he would say that he doesn't know exactly what to do. He has those ideas that he puts out there, but he recommends, bonds, and he recommends you have some even stocks. So it's kind of like
hedge fund.
So you would assume that because of that, he has confidence that if there is some sort of like catastrophic event, okay, the world isn't going to collapse, right? There's going to be some sort of transition, because I think the global elite, as he puts it, their interest is not for the whole world to go into chaos.
A god needs worshippers.
They need subjects. Yeah, they do.
A king needs subjects.
Absolutely.
You kill off all your slaves, you got no one to work. Yep. So they want to extract as much out of the world as they can to make themselves wealthy, and sometimes they maybe go too far and actually kill off their slaves. And that's an unfortunate analogy, but it's very, very true. We're a slave. We look at the taxes you pay. You are a slave to.
You're forced to do certain things.
Yeah, and it'll get more and more and more. Yeah.
Well, and in the end, I'd say having an open mind, right? Really looking at the world, looking at books, looking at opinions, and as objective as a perspective as possible is a way in which you can enhance, your overall take on things. And when these type of events happen, you know what to do.
For sure.
Because most people are just they're caught in this just kind of this vicious cycle of what society is telling them is the right thing to do. And I think we're, this American, the American way is becoming so destructive, not in the present, but also from the future, because we're becoming so much more dependent on others, on government, on technology, on business. Right. Really, in the end, I think Americans, their idea and their educational level just continues to decline. Now, maybe not educational from like reading and writing and arithmetic, but education from really understanding society, economics, finance, because that's where the wool's pulled over eyes as books like these are written, or you have news headlines or certain world events that are occurring, right, that the G20 and the G7, these the meetings that occur up in Jackson Hole and Davos, people are like, oh, but do they really understand what that means? They understand who's there. Do they understand what decisions are being made, what discussions are occurring? If they did, they would definitely have a different behavior associated with it. And that's where today everyone kind of has the same 9 to 5, go home, sit on the couch, drink a beer, watch a movie, go to bed, right? It's this whole, this vicious cycle that people are in, and it continues to exacerbate. And I think that continues to pull the wool over people's eyes, allowing for, really a lot of this stuff to happen behind the scenes.
I would echo this point you made earlier in the podcast. You said something pretty intelligent. You said something to the effect of, if I know that I'm the generator of my wealth, my brain is. And this book is a lot about losing what you have, which is called panic. It's losing what you have. People are less worried about losing what they have if they know they have the ability to get it back, if that makes sense to you.
Absolutely.
I worry less. I mean, you know what? If a great investor gets wiped out, it's painful, but it's not fatal, and that's a big deal because they know how to make it again. After the big shifts come and the transfer, I didn't see that one coming. All right, learn from my mistake, a little smaller.
Yeah. But
if you know how to, Robert Kiyosaki says it really, really well. If you have to have a job, you're kind of dead. If you're dependent on a job to make money, you're kind of dead because then you're dependent. But if you know how to make money in the world without a job, you'll make some mistakes and you'll have some losses. Maybe there'll be things that I don't see coming. But if I have confidence in my ability to deliver value to the world, if I understand a little bit about investing, then I can make my own money and I can recover from things. I certainly don't want to lose what I have. I'm not begging for that test. But when those tests come, your spirit, your entrepreneurial determination, your never quit, these things don't need to be fatal, even if they're painful.
And those are the things that you really can't have taken from you. I mean, I guess you could, but what you know and who you know.
Your knowledge, those are your experience,
and who you know. And that, I think that those are more valuable than anything tangible, because that's really where everything tangible comes from.
Great read. Excited to talk more about it. Really, really gonna. This book was different than Currency Wars. It was like a lot different than The New Case for Gold.
Yes,
felt like someone different almost wrote it. The prose is even different.
Yep.
Sounds like a different guy. He's much more. I feel like this is more him. Maybe it's all the stories.
And those stories are really what are not necessarily validate his point, compelling, but they clarify where he's coming from.
Yeah.
And I think you're halfway through, I'm halfway through the book, but I think that, as he kind of makes his case, I kind of know where he's going to an extent, but the way in which he's formulated it has been really, really good. It's been from a less academic perspective.
For sure.
Okay, Road to Ruin, Jim Rickards, The Global Elite's Secret Plan for the Next Financial Crisis.
What a great subtitle.
And
whoever they are.
The cover of the book is pretty cool too.
It's got little dollar bills marching up to the top of a hill to be in a fire.
To be in this huge
I don't know why
fire.
they march up there. They must not be able to. They must be cold.
I'm sure there's a lot of symbolism to that.
It pretty much looks like a nuclear holocaust at the top. Whatever's going on there isn't good.
Well, I think it's a good read. There needs to be some context behind it. Okay, so understanding kind of some fundamentals of money. But if you've been listening to this podcast or Andy's podcast for a while, you understand. I think way more than enough to actually understand the book.
Yeah, and you know what? If you don't understand something, you Google it. I do that all the time. There's stuff I run to all the time I didn't know.
Yep.
So I say, well, what's that? And it's a great way to learn.
No, and that's what's
smart guy.
Yeah. Well, for one, I'll make one last point. It's interesting to see how Robert Kiyosaki studies, because he's very, it's not like speed through something. It's very slow, methodical, and it's this kind of almost like at a microscopic level, taking one little point or two little points, and then going into that and really figuring out meaning and context.
I can tell you a couple things. I know Robert fairly well. We've been friends for a long time, and when you look at a book after he studies it, there's two things that you'll notice. Number one is he has these little tabs he puts in there. There's hundreds of them.
Yeah, I know.
He marks and
highlights
and writes. But the other thing is many people don't engage in encore reading. Many people read a book once and feel that, okay, I read that book, and it's an illusion and a lie and a fallacy. Say, okay, I now understand that thing. And in fact, I tell people, if you really want to learn something, don't read a book, write one. Because when you're the author of the book, I guarantee that Jim knows more than Robert and I do and you do, because Jim wrote the book. And for us to say, oh, we read it, now we understand everything he was trying to say,
you don't.
Not even close.
Nope.
So a book like this, encore reading, and we usually study one initially for 6 months, but we also keep the ones we've read over the years close by, because we don't want to lose those lessons.
Mm-mm.
And it's interesting to put them side by side, and I think it makes a guy smarter. Hope it does. I don't know if it's making me smarter, but it's making the people I hang out with a lot smarter.
Well, and also it's the discussion and the study around it, right? When you're able to have a dialogue with others, because it's what did he say, and then something that maybe you don't understand, okay, I do, and vice versa, and then you take that and it actually enhances the learning process. So that's what I love about your study groups. All right, man. Well, let's do it. We'll do a follow up to this in the next
really
little bit.
Good to see. It's always fun, man.
And likewise,
we can talk. We could do this forever. So we gotta
seriously. We can pull off like a Tim Ferriss or Joe Rogan marathon podcast. We should just do those. We'll do one of those. A 5-hour podcast. Like what?
Joe Rogan says they can put on double speed. I don't care.
Or triple.
Yeah, that's what he says. I can't put it past double. My mind won't work that fast.
All right, Andy. It's good having you.
Thanks, Patrick.
You've been listening to the Wealth Standard Podcast, the gold standard in all things financial.